The Nintendo 64 versus the Nintendo GameCube. Well, this is kind of awkward. Two of Nintendo's consoles that were dramatically outsold by the respective PlayStation consoles of their eras, but still sold well enough that most people know what they are and have pretty devoted fan bases. You know, the Wii U really should just throw its own party where nobody is invited. I do that, it's called poopin'. What's always been a really odd experience for me is that I've never heard anything but nice things said about the Nintendo 64 in person. Maybe that's just the type of people I run into, but when I look online, there's tons of hate for the console. Perhaps people just don't want to say they hate stuff I love to my face. Nobody says they hate bananas to me either. Maybe it's just the vibe I give off. But contrast the N64 with the GameCube and plenty of people have told me they hate it, especially back in the day. Heck, playing games on a TI-83 calculator got more respect at my high school back then. Nowadays, GameCube has earned itself a much better reputation, and it didn't even have to do anything but wait for people to be more reasonable. The exact same games in console, but with a far more fair perspective applied to it. The Wii U is pretty patient. Let's see how that works out. The new outlook that's been trending for the GameCube is one that's pretty easy to get behind. The games are really good, but are particularly unique. Sounds ideal to me, and the unique factor is probably the biggest thing that differentiates the GameCube from the Nintendo 64. Not that the N64 doesn't have unique games, but while they both have games in a lot of the same series, the N64 received entries that fell more in line with what the mass market wanted, whereas many of the GameCube entries were considered weird. I'm telling you, people were freaking out in a bad way over the reveal of Wind Waker's art style. You know, that art style that's considered super cool and timeless now? Funny how time can change things. What was once considered weird is now considered unique. And once series have had time to fill out with a lot of entries, being weird or unique can help certain games stick out more. Double Dash is the Mario Kart game that lets you put two players in one kart. Super Mario Sunshine is the Mario game that gives you a water gun backpack. F-Zero GX is the one that was made by Sega and maybe the last and best game in the series. The GameCube has always felt more experimental to me. I had to try to talk mine out of getting plastic surgery done. Did it anyway. At least I was able to tack it out of growing a mustache, but it makes sense the GameCube would be experimental since Nintendo has a habit of being experimental, and they'd already released foundational entries for a lot of their biggest game franchises with the Nintendo 64. The first 3D Super Mario game, the first Mario Kart game with fully 3D graphics, the first 3D Zelda game. While inventive, creative, and well-made in their own right, the GameCube entries were clearly trying to go in a different direction that would subvert people's expectations. People can argue over whether or not certain chances taken by the GameCube era worked out or not, but what I will argue is that I'm glad they differed from what we'd find on the Nintendo 64, and am thankful for the variety it creates between the consoles. I really like the GameCube and Nintendo 64, by the way, and if you want proof, I got this beauty for the N64, and this beauty for the GameCube. Just a worn out stool, you say? But oh no, it's an exclusive that I received for buying the console on launch day that you can no longer get nowadays. Oh. But you can't get one that has decades worth of your very own Super Smash Bros. Induced butt sweat, now can ya? Hey, that's what the tagline at the bottom should have been. When it comes to the visuals the consoles are capable of, I gotta say that it feels like a pretty big jump from the N64 to the GameCube. Anytime I've been playing a lot of N64 and switch over to the GameCube without thinking about it, it always makes me think, whoa. Although, full disclosure, I do have the GameCube running on component cables with progressive scan enabled on a smaller display, which I think makes the image look really clean. More than anything, This makes me think about how noticeable the graphical leaps between console generations were back then. Point being, it was a graphical leap you could notice, especially with how young 3D was during the N64 generation. There was a lot of room for improvement. You ever look back at old photos of yourself and it's kind of awkward? It is for me. That's sort of what it's like going from GameCube to the N64, just a little rougher around the edges. But besides how the games look, what about how they play, and specifically, how they control? It's hard to deny that with the extra time afforded to the GameCube, it tends to be smoother, certainly in terms of camera controls, but we gotta talk about the controllers themselves. Enter one of gaming's dirtiest dogs, the Nintendo 64 controller. Whether you find it to be endearing and love it, or find it to be hideous and hate it, everyone seems to have an opinion about this thing and acknowledges its peculiarity. Naturally, the GameCube controller gets criticized as well, though not as much as the N64 controller, and from my experience was criticized a lot more back in the day because everything about the GameCube was criticized back then. But like the GameCube itself, its controller has a pretty solid reputation nowadays for its precise analog stick and comfortable form factor, among other things, to the point that the GameCube controller continued to be produced decades after its initial release. On the flip side, the N64 controller has just seen a rise in alternatives to using it being produced, though it does have the Switch Online version you can get. Regardless, that should tell you all you need to know about the popularity of the two. I think the GameCube controller is better, but still, I personally have always liked the N64 controller as well because it was such an unconventional design. It's essentially become one of a kind, and I like the distinct feel it has when I use it. Quick little game for you that I like to call Name That Controller. First one, let's see. 1, 2, 3. Yep, gotta be N64. Next up, let's see. My guess would be the Xbox Duke controller. Well, agree to disagree. Next up, yeah. Those comfortable handles and distinct triggers, gotta be the GameCube. And next, don't even have to check my guess on this one, pure goodness, baby. But whether you're playing the GameCube or Nintendo 64, you're likely going to want to have a whole bunch of controllers for either system, since local multiplayer was a huge emphasis. That's part of what makes the comparison between these two consoles a little awkward as well. Typically, local 4-player multiplayer is an advantage that these consoles would have over other systems. But here it's a feature of both since they're related. I would never say to my sister, "Have you ever met my dad?" Although I suppose that could be a thing with step-siblings. But obviously, the N64 emphasized the feature first, and the GameCube was like, yeah, let's keep doing that. Right down to the detail of having a lot of different colors of the controller with matching plugs to tell which of your friends was which color, including the color of Timmy's controller, invisible. Haha, you can't win if you can't play, Timmy. But yeah, a lot of great local 4-player games for both of these consoles. I'd have a hard time choosing a clear winner because there's just so many. When it comes to the overall libraries of the consoles, as you'd expect, each console has some really solid Nintendo games, but when it comes to support from other developers, I'd be quick to give the edge to the GameCube if it weren't for one little thing. Actually, one big thing. Rareware. They were huge for the Nintendo 64, delivering an extensive library of bangers before being bought by Microsoft, at which point the world has not been quite right ever since. Of course, the Nintendo 64 also has some great games that were not made by Rare or Nintendo that people often overlook. But I'd still say the GameCube got better support from a larger number of developers, unsurprisingly too, since Nintendo prioritized getting more developers on board for the GameCube since the N64 was criticized for not having enough. Ultimately, if I'm listening to my head, the GameCube wins, but if I'm listening to my heart, it's the Nintendo 64. But my head also tells me to listen to my heart, so it would be the Nintendo 64. The bangers at the top just bang a little bit harder for me personally, but if I had to guess what the majority of all of you would pick, I think GameCube would win the majority vote, for whatever that's worth to you, which is probably not worth anything because people only care about their own choice. But with that, I would indeed be curious to hear which console you'd choose, and of course, why. So leave a comment down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's the retro bird.